Aloha. So we're going to ask you now in the audience to help us with something. Please tell us which 5 topics are the ones we really need to talk about more in Hawaii. So we're going to take a little poll, and you can only vote for one of the 5. I will read the options, and once Doug gets back, he'll help us with the fast thoughts that we have on each of these before you vote. And all of us going to be able to see the results live on the poll tab. So the basic question is, which energy topics are we not paying enough attention to in Hawaii? The first one is, who is really defining renewable energy in Hawaii? In the year when the legislature focused on Covet and their work on energy was more in the feel-good category, the PUC decision on Honua case and the Hawaii Supreme Court decision on greenhouse gas impacts set the parameters for which types of projects will actually move forward. Do we really need to fix the definition of renewable energy, and whose job is it to do so? The second question is, what prevents local government from expediting the permitting process that stunts solar employment? And we got Doug back on. Maybe you want to explain a little bit about how the permitting process is connected to jobs. Well, basically, local government is slowing down our ability possibly to add solar jobs. In the last recession, the demand for rooftop PV continues to be strong even in economic times. The time to require to get a permit for 3 or 4 days of field work actually sometimes, at least on Oahu, takes up to at least 6 months. Question 3 is, are we dampening the desire for electric vehicles before it even starts? EV owners have lost their privileges. I think you've seen everything in the news about some critics asking why Tesla owners need free parking or the airport. But this year, EV owners in Hawaii were hit from all sides when their free parking was taken away or allowed to sunset, while a new EV registration was added. So the question becomes, what kind of incentives, when EVs are less than 1% of the cars on the road, are we giving EV owners to be a part of EV ownership? The fourth one is community-based renewable energy salvageable? Community solar could fail again, or maybe not. CBRE perhaps was too wonky and practical from the get-go, or maybe just easy to game. Those questions occurred after the first phase of community-based renewable energy, when projects failed to materialize. The PUC is in the process of revamping the entire process for CBRE, and companies have submitted fresh, updated RFPs. Thus, the jury is still out on this renewed effort. Finally, does deferring utility losses during COVID-19 adversely affect ratepayers? Deferring losses by the electric utility holds potential pitfalls for the ratepayer. Thus, some states have moved quickly to say that COVID-related losses are not absorbed, should not be absorbed by the ratepayers. So far, the commission in Hawaii, the PUC, is allowing electric utilities to defer these losses, but the treatment by the commission is not clear who will be left holding the bag for most of these costs.
Right. That is the key thing. I'm sorry you couldn't hear me before, Frank, and thanks for leading on those. And we're just asking you folks, which of these is really something that we should be talking about, but we're not? Is it the R in RPS? Is it whether community solar is really workable? Please help us get this figured out. Thanks. What's coming up, number 1?
It looks like who's really defining renewable energy in Hawaii. Interesting.
Interesting. There was a big argument, whether the legislature needed to fix this or whether it was kind of being fixed on its own just by the type of projects that were getting approved. So that's an interesting, that the audience is seeing it that way. Very interesting.
And the courts also got involved in that as well, right, with Honua. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Frank, I'm getting some notes here. I think that we need to let them go hear from our next panel.
Yes. So why don't you highlight a little bit for us in the next panel, Doug?
Sure, real quickly, I think one of the things we're excited about is this is the first time for a larger audience to hear from the new Chief Energy Officer for the state of Hawaii. So Scott Glenn is on this panel, and I know he's made some comments already about what he sees as the importance of jobs. So let's go ahead and let them kind of get to it. And again, we appreciate all your patience in the audience as we work through all the technology. Thank you.
Number 2, Doug, is permitting. I'm just looking at that. So
not a surprise. Yeah,
so let's move to
if
the
you
next
can do
panel.
the job in 3 days, you need 6 months to get the permit.
Mahalo.
So back to the panel, we're going to be talking about solar jobs and being part of the solution. And I'm joined by 3 awesome panelists. First up is Miss Odette Mucha. Odette is the Southeastern Regulatory Director for Vote Solar, where she advances solar energy priorities in Florida, the Carolinas, and Virginia. Prior to Vote Solar, Odette worked at the U.S. Department of Energy's Sunshot Initiative, leading research and development in solar workforce, community solar, and low-income solar access. She also enjoyed a short but sweet assignment on the energy team at Pacific Command here in beautiful Kailua. We miss you, Odette, and we're glad you're joining us here. Odette has a master's degree in international affairs from the Fletcher School of Law and diplomacy at Tufts University, and a BA in government and French from Cornell University. Next, we have Scott Glenn. Scott is the Chief Energy Officer currently for the Hawaii State Energy Office, a post he was appointed to on October 16th, 2019, which makes for exciting times for Scott to be our new CEO. As the Chief Energy Officer, Scott develops, manages, and implements statewide programs for energy efficiency, renewable energy, and clean transportation to help achieve a resilient clean energy economy. Prior to this role, he served as the director of the OEQC, or Office of Environmental Quality and Control, since 2015, where he did a number of things, such as leading the modernization of the state environmental review process by developing new administrative rules and updating best practices, where he also advised the governor on environmental quality issues. In addition, Scott was the co-chair of the Sustainable Hawaii Initiative, liaison to the U.S. Climate Alliance, a coalition of U.S. governments committed to the Paris Agreement, and a number of other clean energy and clean environment roles. Scott received his master's degree in urban and regional planning from here in Hawaii at the University of Hawaii in 2009, and he specializes in asset management, environmental planning and compliance, environmental review, and climate change adaptation planning. And then finally, we have Dawn Lippert. Dawn is the CEO of Elemental Accelerator, also known as EEX, a nonprofit startup organization based here in Hawaii and in California. EEX has become one of the most active funders of startups solving urgent climate and environmental challenges. And each year, Environmental Accelerator funds 15 to 20 companies up to $1 million each to improve systems that impact the planet and people's lives in energy, water, agriculture, transportation, and much more. Currently, EEX has a portfolio of over 100 companies that have gone on to collectively raise follow-on funding of over $1.5 billion. EEX is funded by a coalition of utility partners, corporate partners, philanthropic organizations, and the U.S. Navy. Dawn also serves as the chair of the Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative Advisory Board, a group of decision makers who ensure progress towards Hawaii goals of 100% RPS by 2045. And she is a recipient of the 2015 C3E Award from the Clean Energy Ministerial and is a 2015 Omidyar Fellow. She founded the Women in Renewable Energy Group in Hawaii and serves on the board of the Incubate Energy Network. Sorry, Dawn, if I got that wrong. So I'm going to give each panelist a couple minutes to kind of introduce themselves and then outline their thoughts on this panel, and we'll get into the panel itself. I'm going to start with Dawn.
All right. Thanks so much, Will. Thanks so much for having me. So a couple of thoughts as we think about sort of jobs and where we are in this panel and where we are in the recovery. Just 3 things are sort of top of mind. So as you mentioned, we fund startups across climate technology, so energy, water, food and agriculture, mobility, and circular economy. So a couple of thoughts from that world. The first is that the innovation ecosystem is really strong. The first quarter of 2020, we saw some major moves from corporates into climate and a lot of interest in innovation. Some billion-dollar funds have been announced by Amazon, Microsoft, and Apple and others. And so some really interesting movement in climate in sort of first couple quarters. There was a lot of question marks as COVID came into play, what would happen with innovation ecosystem. But even in the last couple of weeks, we've seen capital coming back into the ecosystem and a lot of interest from funders in climate technology. So I think the first point is just that the investing landscape is pretty strong. The second one is that as we're looking at what's needed in innovation and how to help innovation create really good quality jobs, what's happening with sort of the macro large clean energy projects in Hawaii and more broadly, but particularly in Hawaii, is the most important indicator for how quickly innovation companies can come to market and scale. So whatever we're doing to accelerate large scale solar adoption, distributed generation, energy storage, local agriculture, regenerative agriculture, better water systems, all of these things and all of these projects help pull forward the innovation and the jobs that we want to see in that space. And then the last, just sort of quick intro of what we're seeing is that the interest from youth and new talent, both from sort of youth and people coming from other industries, whether it's traditional technology or retail or tourism, visitor industry, there's a huge amount, a surge of interest in coming into clean energy and climate. And we've seen that just over even the last 12 to 18 months. And I think what we're thinking a lot about with many of the partners that are attending here today is how to ensure that there are sufficient on-ramps for people to come into really good paying, long-term climate and energy related jobs. So whether that looks like internships, fellowships, veterans programs, reskilling, upskilling, those are the kinds of things that we're thinking about because there's a huge amount of interest. This year alone, for the internship program that we opened with only a dozen or so slots, there were 350 applicants, most of which are from Hawaii with so much interest and passion to work in climate and in solving problems. So those are my sort of three opening thoughts. Innovation is really strong. We need a very strong and fast moving energy and water and regenerative agriculture industry to pull forward that innovation and those jobs. And the third point is around creating on-ramps for folks.
All right, thanks, Dawn. I'll move us next to Odette. If you could give us a couple minutes of your thoughts of this panel before we get into it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Will, and everyone for having me. Aloha. My name is Odette Muka, and I work with Vote Solar. We're an advocacy organization, and we promote solar access, but also try to promote the inclusivity of the energy space. And in response to COVID, our organization has been engaged at the state level around asking for a shutoff or moratorium of shutoff during the COVID crisis, just taking into account the fact that people are reliant on electricity and just because they can't afford their bills right now through no fault of their own, doesn't mean people should be sitting through heat waves, for example, without power. So that's been a major focus of the organization in the near term. And interestingly, it also seems like the conversation is leading to a place where beyond just immediate shutoffs, we're saying, hey, now is an opportunity to think about how we deal with the growing overage problem. So people that, as unemployment rises, people are having larger and larger bills that they're not able to afford. And some of the commissioners mentioned that this is starting to come up on how you deal with those balances. And so we're saying, hey, let energy efficiency and advanced energy be part of that solution. So, we all know energy efficiency can reduce energy burden. So let's make that part of the conversation. And then, of course, in the long term, it's how do you get people back to work. And so solar jobs, obviously, is what we think of. And I think the Recovery Act from 2009 just lends so many lessons of ways that we can, things that work well and ways we can improve moving forward. So for me, looking back at it, I think innovation, Dawn really hammered home. I think that's really the place to invest. It's our opportunity to think about where we want to be in the future and help us get there. So I think the Recovery Act really achieved major milestones just by the sheer amount of investment. Solar, wind, battery technologies came way down in price. And I think a lot of that had to do with the sheer amount of deployment, thanks to the Recovery Act. So I would challenge everyone to think about where do we want to go in the future and how do we invest today to get there. So whatever that is microgrids, is advanced meters, net zero buildings, advanced biofuels for aviation, or flying cars, whatever it is, let's do that. And then one final thought is, how do we bring equity to the forefront in these conversations? So it's one thing to try to get people back to work, of course, but thinking through this as an investment opportunity and making sure the benefits flow to the people that actually need it the most. So how do we incorporate jobs with reducing energy burden? So again, that's of course deep retrofits and energy efficiency, but also thinking about smart thermostats and how that can reduce energy burden. And how does Wi-Fi help in this case as well? Community solar and also storage and microgrids, making sure people that are reliant on energy have access to it when the grid goes down. So I think if we think about equity, it'll just make the future brighter for everyone.
Great. Thanks, Odette. Just a quick note, I think some of the comments I'm getting, it's a little tough to hear, so I don't think people will mind if the phone is a little closer to your face. Because apparently people...
Got it, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Perfect. And then finally, Scott, if you want to tell us a couple minutes about your thoughts about the topic of this panel and in relation to your role as the Chief Energy Officer here in Hawaii.
Thank you, Will, and thank you everyone for having me here today, and to the Maui Economic Development Board for hosting this and moving forward with the virtual conference. I'd like to pause a moment to just reflect on what was said this morning already by Scott Su, by Commissioner Potter, and our other guests, and kind of what was said and what was not said. And I think what I heard was universal agreement from everyone so far that equity matters, and that it's a top of mind matter issue for decision makers, policymakers. And what I didn't hear was that we should be questioning our renewable energy goals or stepping back from our climate change goals. I didn't hear anyone raise whether it was technically feasible or we should reconsider it. Rather, I think the common thought is that we do need to achieve these goals, and they matter even more now in this context. And what matters is the how. How we do this is what we really need to engage on now. It's not a technical question of can we achieve a 100% RPS? It's how we get there, and how we ensure that the benefits and the impacts of achieving these goals are equitably distributed, and so that everyone has the opportunity to take advantage of it, and no one community is overly burdened with the impacts of this transition. And I think that's also what we need to think about as decision makers and policymakers as we engage and try to push forward the actual projects and help support companies that move the needle on this. Is what is the distribution of those impacts? Who does benefit? Who is adversely affected by something? And I think we're seeing now that people are actively exploring this question. We have groups like Uplift Hawaii, which Don is a part of. The Aina Aloha Economic Futures group is also having these conversations about how do we pursue a transformation of Hawaii with these big lofty goals, but in a way that's more equitable and grounded in a real community grassroots level of support, so that there is a meaningful connection from people's everyday lives to these big goals. And I think that's where we really need to spend some time as the state, as counties, as stakeholders in this discussion, is helping connect how rooftop solar, how 100% RPS makes a meaningful difference in an individual person's life. And so, these kinds of conversations I think are really important, because having business leaders, having community on this call today and participating in this is a way to have that conversation together. And so with that, maybe turn back over to you to get more into the discussion.
Sure. Thanks, Scott. Before we begin a little bit diving deeper, just a note that you guys can post, all the audience can post questions that we'll go through in the time that we have in the Q&A section of the panel window. So if you have any burning questions that you'd like to get in there, I'll be monitoring that. I wrote an op-ed with my intern at the time, Allison, back in April or May about jobs and solar specifically. But again, for this panel, I think we can expand it to just behind the meter resources and renewable jobs in general. So think bigger. But one of the things that I did to prepare for that op-ed was I reread FDR's speech that he gave at the Democratic National Convention before he was elected president, where he was talking about, the need for just, I guess to use Elizabeth Warren's term, big structural change, but way back in the 20s and 30s at the time. And I was thinking about that now, how, we have this shock to the system across the world, but in Hawaii especially, where, our economy is primarily based on things like tourism, and tourism just isn't happening. And we've seen the impacts of that. And so one of the things that I've been thinking about, and maybe you all can comment on, is, what does Hawaii look like in the next year or 2 years, where we build an economy that's based on things like clean energy jobs? What are the steps that we have to take to get there? And what are the, I guess, reckonings that we need to have as a community, as a state, to take those steps to get to the economy that we'd all like to see, if we very well don't have any large amount of tourism for the next year or two? Maybe I'll push this one first to Dawn, partly because I think your organization is really future focused, and then we'll go from there.
Sure. Yeah, I can provide a sort of an initial thoughts there. I think large structural change is a really important piece of this. I think the other thing to recognize, and as we talk about equity in particular, is that equity does not lift everyone in the same way. There are absolutely people who are benefiting from current power structures who will have to give something up and will experience loss as a result of having a more equitable policies and more equitable distribution. So I think that, it's interesting, I think Scott's point around, we now sort of agree that we need to go to our renewable energy goals. We agree we cannot compromise our climate change goals, and we agree that it's technically feasible to get there. I think now there's a general agreement about sort of equity, but where those trade-offs actually happen and what they look like is a much more difficult conversation. And I think we are still really grappling with that as a community. And so some of the work we're trying to do at Uplift Hawaii is to bring some of those voices in, and Aina Aloha and others are really active in this as well, to think about how we actually make those trade-offs. So I think that's one piece I just wanted to share. The other piece I think about what it will look like in the future is that we have to get, I think, much more flexible about how we think about Hawaii's place in the global economy. So when I'm thinking about it from an innovation perspective, we just had a little article in Hawaii Business from Richard Matsui, who's the CEO of KWH Analytics, one of our portfolio companies. He's a Punahou grad that moved home just a couple months ago because he realized if he gets up early, he can actually run his growing, successful solar startup from Hawaii, and be near his family, and have his baby spend time with the family here. And so I think we have an enormous opportunity right now to think differently about how to bring in talent, whether it's entrepreneurs, innovators, board members, technical folks to Hawaii, from the technology industry, from other industries who can work from here and think about Kama'aina Come Home in a completely different way than we have before. Because typically it's been that the job is the hurdle to getting people back to Hawaii or living in Hawaii. If that is no longer the case, there's a very different economic picture that we could start painting around having some of these really talented Kama'aina or talented workers coming to Hawaii and finding community and making their home here. So I think that's one thing I would share. And then on the flip side, it's also so much easier to access capital and talent from Hawaii than it ever has been before. I mean, we're very actively engaging with folks all over Asia and all over the mainland. Most of the funding from Elemental Accelerator comes from Asia and the mainland, other places, and we bring that to Hawaii. And it has been a real benefit in some ways that everyone's virtual in terms of being able to connect resources to Hawaii. So I think those are just two thoughts of how talent can come to Hawaii that might not have been able to before, and Hawaii can now access talent from offshore that we were not able to before. So I think we can be much more creative in our thinking here.
So can I latch on to this equity question, and let's think about maybe, I obviously I think about myself a lot, because who doesn't think about themselves? Because you don't live in other people's brains. But I run this solar organization, but I live in an apartment and I don't have my own roof. And my fiance works in the food industry, and at the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, she basically lost all of her hours for a couple months, and then there's been a little buildup like that. But she has a bachelor's degree, and she has done baking for a while, but she could very well do other things. But if we wanted to get her involved in the economy, say that she lost her job, or somebody that works in the tourism industry lost their job, and wants to stay here in Hawaii and wants to work in an industry that's not tourism, what are some pathways that the state or policymakers might create to get those jobs into the economy? And maybe Scott, you can kind of tackle some ideas that you've been thinking about.
Sure. We are looking at a couple different ways for how we can address that. One of the, I think, things to start thinking about, you mentioned kind of the next 1 or 2 years. Structural change often takes a long time to really play out and manifest. You might make a change in 1 or 2 years have to pass before people really realize what's happened. And we look back and we say, oh, that was the change that led to our situation now. And so the way that the Energy Office has been thinking about this and engaging with others has been thinking about kind of 3 different buckets. What can we do in the next 1 or 2 years that can get people back to work? What are kind of the more intermediate term 2 to 4 years? And then what are those longer term things that we need to start doing now to get the payoff in 5 years or 10 years? And focusing on the 1 or 2 years, what we're looking at, so the Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism is pending the state budget finalization, is looking to roll out an internship program to bring on folks that are college graduates, high school graduates, or displaced workers, especially from the tourism industry, who are looking to get basically kind of earn while you learn experience. We don't want to call it necessarily an internship, because you actively are working, it's for all ages, and trying to help use some of the CARES money to let folks get a foot into these industries that we want to promote and develop experience and talent for. Clean energy first and foremost, but also the other pieces of the Aloha Plus Challenge, if you're familiar with that. Looking at the other goals that the state has too, especially food production and agriculture. How can we get folks into these industries? What comes after this program and the CARES Act money finishes is what we're working on now, so that we can provide real job pathways for people who were in tourism, for example, get an internship with a clean energy company, get some experience, and then once the CARES Act program wraps up, have an opportunity to now use that experience in a new pathway for themselves. That's probably first and foremost with us. We're also looking at the development pipeline for HECO's phase 1, phase 2 projects, and what kind of hiring and skills will they need. And we're also looking at the labor suppliers, the unions, the colleges, and the different apprenticeship programs to see, are they producing the skills that will be needed for these projects that are coming over the next 4 or 5 years? And can we help with skill matching, labor supply matching? So there's a lot, I think, in the works that will be coming up in the next few months that have been being put together over the last couple months while we were trying to figure out how we deal with COVID and position ourselves to do something once we're ready to move forward.
Can I understand the point from Scott real quick on that one too? Because I think this, the upcoming sort of renewable energy development and what's happening in our economy really deserves sort of an exclamation point, because as we have at least $3.5 billion of investment in solar and storage and renewable energy projects over the next couple of years alone, that's like our own mini stimulus. And how we actually use that to create on-ramp and opportunity is sort of an amazing opening for our state. So I think this is exactly the right time to be thinking about it, and for people to really kind of be leaning in from whatever sort of position they're in, whether it's university, business, government, et cetera, to figure out how we take advantage of this.
Yeah, so, okay. Well, this panel's a little bit lightning fast, but I do want to ask Odette for kind of a national perspective, because I think one of the great things about this conference in the past, and now especially when we have so many people who are able to see it, is that Hawaii can kind of co-opt ideas from all over the place. And Odette, I'm wondering, you lived here in Kailua, but now I think you're based on the East Coast, but you're working for an organization that deals with solar policy and renewable energy policy all across the United States. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, what are some ideas that maybe you're seeing in other places that would be applicable in a recovery for Hawaii?
Yeah, thanks, Will. I think in so many ways, Hawaii is leading when it comes to solar, when it comes to grid modernization. So in a lot of ways, we all are looking towards you, and you all have a chance to set the stage for the rest of us. Of course, California and some of the other commissioners that were on earlier are great examples. And when it comes to jobs, what strikes me as the very challenging opportunity that perhaps you all as leaders can tackle is manufacturing. We're mandating solar to be on every new roof. Well, how do we make those Hawaii-made solar panels, or even the software that goes into them, or the widgets? I think that is perhaps one of those longer-term projects that can actually start to develop some new jobs that, like Don was saying, will bring people to Hawaii, and I think there's massive opportunity there.
Great. Well, I know we've only got a few minutes left, but I do want to look at a couple questions. So here's a good question from Jamie Farron, and I think this kind of follows on a little bit of what Scott was talking about related to kind of industry outreach and partnerships. But the question is, are there any plans to create academic or industry partnerships in order to fund research related to renewable energy here in Hawaii, for instance, biometric or metamaterials for new solar panels, or anything on the horizon that might create economic development?
Yeah, that's a great question. Department of Energy has been funding a lot of research. They've been putting out a lot of proposal requests lately. And I think Hawaii Natural Energy Institute and NELHA in particular, as two academic centers, have been looking to do the kind of research projects that you're talking about. So I think there is a kind of basic material science, basic energy science work going on through the university system. And I'm not personally as familiar with how much industry is tied in with that research, but I don't think that there's a resistance to working that kind of collaboration. Don might have more insight to that than I do.
Don?
Yeah, I think we see a lot of potential with universities, and then also with research institutions like NELHA. So one of our portfolio companies, for instance, Blue Ocean Barns, is opening up their sort of production of red seaweed at NELHA. Red seaweed, when fed to cattle, does like a little additive or sort of a spice in their feed, can reduce methane by up to 80%. So they're looking at ramping up that significantly, probably hiring 100 people over the next couple of years there. So I think there's a lot of opportunities in agriculture that we're seeing in particular, beyond just sort of the energy sector. In our latest application round, we got about 800 applicants to the accelerator from 59 countries all over the world, a lot from Hawaii. And more than about half of the ones in Hawaii have an agriculture nexus, and we're involved in agriculture. So I think there's a lot going on here in agriculture innovation. That's where we've seen some of the university and academic institutions be the most active. But there's certainly more we can do. I would say specifically around having university technologies and innovations or spin out into the community. That's where there's a lot of focus from kind of the UH Ventures group, and a lot of potential that we really haven't even tapped into yet as much as we could.
Great. I see Doug McLeod has joined us.
Well, I am, and you guys have had some really interesting things to say. It kind of makes me feel a little more optimistic about Hawaii than when we started this panel. And Odette, thank you for your words as well. But yeah, we're getting ready to kind of move on. But if you guys want to wrap up, you have another minute here. Go ahead, Will, please.
Sure. So yeah, maybe I'll wrap us up. And I wanted to first thank Odette and Scott and Don for taking time out of their days to come and talk. Even though the panel was short, I've had some conversations with the three of you together and individually, and I do feel optimistic about all of this. And it's a very interesting time. It's a tough time for all of us. And I was thinking this morning about how, I'm dealing with it economically, I'm dealing with it personally, and we all are kind of going on a strange journey together. But it's very encouraging to see folks like you all working very hard to not only maintain but accelerate the goals that we have in a time when it's hard to think about what is coming tomorrow or next week. So I'm excited to see how everything turns out. I'm excited to see what Don's companies bring to the table, what Scott's organization, and how the state deals with all of this, and where they're going to put their resources and time, and how Odette kind of brings it all together. And then hopefully my members can hire a bunch of people and we can really build a sustainable, renewable economy. So I'm sorry that we didn't get to all the questions, but again, I wanted to thank all of you guys for being part of this panel, and for the Maui Economic Development Board and the Hawaii Energy Conference for allowing me to moderate it.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah. Thanks to all of you for participating. Frank, do you want to go ahead and describe what we have next for the audience?
Well, next we have a video from Ulupono Initiative. They've been great friends of the conference since its beginning. And then when we return from the video, we'll have the panel develop with us, not for us.
Ulupono Initiative's mission is to improve the quality of life for the people of Hawaii by working to produce more local food, more renewable energy, clean transportation, and then better management of water and waste. I'd say there's probably been three major broad lessons that I've learned that kind of apply to things beyond just what we do at Ulupono. When you're dealing with these huge challenges, you're far more likely to be successful if you care more about getting it right rather than being right. So that was probably number one. Number two would be that who you collaborate with makes all the difference. Third one is also when you have these difficult challenges, as changing our dependencies on fossil fuel and imported food is, you have to use the whole toolbox. So 10 years down the road, we'd like to see some real changes in Hawaii. We want to see farmers and ranchers using best practices and technology to earn a good living while they're making food for us. We'd like to see renewable energy be the status quo and fossil fuels be fading away. And for transportation, we hope to see more clean options, active options, and options that are not the standard single occupancy vehicle as well. And also would like to see better management of our freshwater resources.
Within the last 10 years, there has been more innovation in Hawaii's energy utility regulatory landscape than over the previous century. Performance-based regulation, or PBR, is a regulatory framework being explored by stakeholders in Hawaii's energy community. It is a good example of a 21st century regulatory model that will improve the utility's efficiency, provide more clean energy, and better serve customers' electricity needs. The Hawaii Public Utilities Commission is leading the charge on this transformation, developing a PBR framework that ties the energy utilities' revenues to key outcomes. Until now, the utility has been under cost of service regulation, where it recovers costs plus a return on any investments it makes, essentially rewarding higher costs with higher revenues. Performance-based regulation, on the other hand, requires higher performance for higher revenues, coming closer to the way things work in competitive markets. While regulators in other states have adopted some elements of PBR, the bold efforts in our PUC proceeding demonstrates our state's commitment to a complete reframing of the compact between the electric utility, its ratepayers, and the Commission. Hawaii has already secured a reputation as an energy innovator by being the first state to require a 100% renewable energy portfolio standard by 2045. Now, with performance-based regulation, our state is once again leading the way by working with the utility to shift the focus from recovering costs to achieving even higher performance for the people of Hawaii.